Conrad Sterling's voice cut across the airfield like he owned the sky itself. Hey, you there. Yes, you. Stop pretending you're doing something important and come carry these bags. He didn't wait for an answer. He never did. The man in the worn jacket crouching beside the landing gear didn't even look up. And that made Conrad's jaw tighten in a way his investors had learned to recognize the particular irritation of a powerful man being ignored by someone he considered beneath him. I said, move. We're on a schedule. If you've ever watched someone be dismissed like they were furniture, you know exactly what happened next and you won't want to look away. This story is for everyone who was ever underestimated by the wrong person. That speaks to you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what's coming will stay with you. Hit the like button and drop your city and country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Grant Holloway turned 43. He woke up at 5:15 without an alarm, the same way he had since his 20s, and lay still for a moment in the gray quiet of his house while the world outside pretended nothing was happening. His daughter Paige was still asleep down the hall. He could hear the ceiling fan in her room doing its slow, asthmatic rotation, the one he'd promised to replace 3 times and hadn't yet, because every weekend something more urgent came up. And the fan kept spinning anyway, protesting but functional, not unlike its owner. He didn't make a production of his birthday. He got up, made coffee in the kitchen with the scratched linoleum floor that Vanessa had complained about for the last 2 years of their marriage, and sat at the table with a legal pad and a pen, and spent 45 minutes going over tolerances on a composite material calculation that had been sitting in the back of his mind since Tuesday. That was Grant Holloway at 43, coffee, calculation, the hum of a fan that needed replacing. His company Holloway Aeronautics, which he had started 9 years ago with a salvaged hangar lease, one engineer he'd poached from a defense contractor, and a personal savings account he'd emptied down to the last $400, was now worth more than most people would believe if he told them. He didn't tell them. That was a choice he'd made early and never revisited. The people who needed to know knew. The people who didn't need to know had no effect on the work either way. He drove Paige to school in a 7-year-old truck that needed the passenger window handle replaced. She sat in the seat with her backpack on her lap and her earbuds in for the first 10 minutes, then pulled one out when they hit the long stretch of road past the water tower. "Are you going to the airfield today?" she asked. "Later this afternoon. I've got meetings until noon." "The Meridian thing?" "The Meridian thing." He glanced at her. "How do you know about that?" "You talk in your sleep." "I do not." "You absolutely do. Last week you said the wing loading is wrong like 4 times. She put the earbud back in, then immediately pulled it out again. "You should get that checked." "The wing loading?" "The sleep talking." He smiled at the road. Paige was 14 and had his eyes and her mother's instinct for the precisely timed observation that lands without warning. It was, Grant had decided, one of the more entertaining things about raising her. He dropped her at the school entrance, watched her disappear into the building, without looking back, the walk of a teenager who has achieved a careful balance between loving her parent and being seen to love her parent, and then turned the truck toward downtown. The conference room at Meridian Capital's satellite office was exactly what Grant expected. Glass walls, catered breakfast nobody was eating, a projector screen showing a slide deck that had clearly been designed by someone who charged by the animation. Across the table sat Raymond Chu, Grant's business partner, and the person most responsible for the fact that Holloway Aeronautics had not collapsed in its first 3 years. Raymond was 10 years older than Grant, moved through rooms like he was conserving energy for a later emergency, and possessed a talent for identifying when a negotiation was about to go sideways that Grant privately thought should be classified as a form of clairvoyance. "They're going to try to restructure the licensing terms," Raymond said quietly, while the Meridian people filed in. "I know. They're going to present it like a gift." "I know that too. You're going to let them present it before you respond." Grant looked at him. "I'm not 12. You made the Wentworth guy feel stupid in front of his team in February, and he's been trying to undercut the Singapore contract ever since. The Wentworth guy was wrong about the pressure cycle data. He was wrong quietly. You made him wrong loudly." Grant accepted this with the small wince of a man who knows he has a flaw and has made peace with its continued existence. The Meridian meeting ran 2 hours and 20 minutes. Grant let their lead attorney walk through the proposed restructuring with the patience of a man watching weather change. When it was done, he asked 3 questions, each one quieter than the last, and by the third question the attorney had stopped making eye contact with his own clients. They didn't get the restructuring. What they got was a 2-year extension on the existing terms and a handshake on a partnership that Raymond, walking out to the elevator, calculated aloud would be worth $11 million by the end of the following fiscal year. 12, Grant said, pressing the lobby button. You think? The certification comes through on schedule. When does it ever come through on schedule? This one will. Raymond studied him the way he sometimes did, with the particular expression of a man who has watched Grant be right about things that should have been impossible to predict and has not entirely made peace with it. You're annoying, he said. Happy birthday to me, Grant said. He got to the Harlow Point airfield at 2:15, which was later than he'd planned because the truck's navigation sent him through a road closure that added 20 minutes and a level of irritation he'd mostly worked through by the time he parked. Harlow Point was a private airfield, mid-sized, the kind of place that got a specific clientele, corporate aviation, charter operations, wealthy private owners who wanted discretion without the overhead of a major airport. Holloway Aeronautics leased 2 hangars there, one for operations, one for a test bed that Grant used when he needed to think through a problem in 3 dimensions rather than on paper. He changed into his work jacket, in the truck an unremarkable dark green thing with oil stains on the left sleeve that he'd been meaning to replace since the previous spring, and walked across the tarmac toward Hangar 2. The afternoon was clear, mid-autumn, the kind of sky that made aircraft maintenance feel like the most sensible occupation in the world. He was midway through an inspection of the landing gear assembly on a Gulfstream that belonged to a client in from Vancouver when he heard the convoy arrive. He didn't look up immediately. The sound of expensive vehicles on an airfield was not unusual, and whatever was happening on the other side of the tarmac was not his concern until it was. He was checking a hydraulic line fitting a small imperfection in the seal that no one who wasn't looking carefully would catch, but that Grant's hands knew before his eyes confirmed it when the voice reached him. You there. He kept his eyes on the fitting. Hey, I'm talking to you. The guy in the green jacket. Grant looked up. The man standing 20 feet away was wearing a suit that fit the way suits fit when someone has paid serious money to make clothing look effortless. He was in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with the particular bearing of a man who has spent decades in rooms where his entrance mattered. Behind him, 3 other men in business attire waited with the practiced patience of people who were paid to wait. A woman stood slightly apart from the group. Grant registered her in the peripheral way that the mind processes things it has already categorized. Then his brain finished the categorization. Vanessa. She was wearing a camel-colored coat he didn't recognize. Her hair different from the way he remembered it, shorter, more structured, and she was standing with the proprietary ease of a woman who belonged to the man beside her, or believed she did. She had seen him. He could tell by the slight stillness that passed through her before she looked away. I need someone to handle luggage, the suited man said. He had the voice of someone accustomed to giving instructions and having them executed without question. Where's the ground crew? There's a crew office on the north side, Grant said. Blue door. I'm not walking to the north side. You're right here. Load the bags onto the aircraft. Grant looked at the man steadily. I'm not ground crew. What? I'm not part of the ground crew. I'm conducting an inspection. The man Conrad. Grant would learn his name soon enough, though he didn't know it yet, looked at Grant the way people sometimes look at a vending machine that has failed to deliver. Not quite anger, more the bafflement of an expectation unmet. You're doing maintenance work on a plane. That makes you a maintenance worker. Load the bags. That's not how any of this works, Grant said, not unkindly. Crew office, north side. They'll have someone to you in 5 minutes. Conrad's expression shifted. The shift was subtle, a compression around the eyes, a slight forward tilt, but Grant had been reading people in professional environments for 20 years, and he recognized it. This was the moment when a man accustomed to authority decided to make a point. Do you know who I am? Conrad asked. No, Grant said. The honesty of it seemed to land strangely. Conrad glanced back at his associates, then at Vanessa, recalibrating. Conrad Sterling, he said, as though the name should produce a visible effect. Sterling Crest Holdings. Grant Holloway. Grant returned his attention to the hydraulic fitting. The crew office is on the north side. There was a pause. He was always like this, Vanessa said. Her voice was the same. That was the thing about voices, they didn't update the way appearances did. Everything else about her had been revised and polished, but the voice was the same one that had told him, sitting at the kitchen table with the scratched linoleum floor, that she couldn't do this anymore. Grant kept his eyes on his work. "You know this man?" Conrad asked her. "He's my ex-husband." The way she said it managed to communicate, without additional words, that this explained everything about the situation. Grant always preferred working with his hands. He thought it made him authentic. "Nothing wrong with working with your hands," Grant said. I didn't say there was, but her tone said otherwise. Conrad made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "So this is the ex. Paige's father." He assessed Grant with the particular thoroughness of a man measuring a competitor he has already dismissed. "Vanessa mentioned you were in aviation. I assumed she meant something more significant." "Conrad," Vanessa said, with the tone of a woman performing restraint. "I'm just making conversation." But he wasn't. He was doing what people like him do when they are certain of their position, testing the edges of it, confirming its dimensions. "So what exactly do you do here? Inspections? Maintenance?" "Among other things." "Must be satisfying." "Honest work." The word honest carried the particular weight of a compliment that isn't one. Grant set down his tool, straightened up, and turned to face Conrad fully for the first time. He was half a head shorter than the man, and leaner, and wearing a jacket with oil on the sleeve, and he was aware of all of this without being troubled by any of it. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "which aircraft is yours?" "The Citation." "Bay 7. Grant nodded slowly. Something moved across his expression, not alarm exactly, but the focused attention of a man whose professional instincts have engaged. "Who completed the pre-flight on it?" Conrad blinked at the change of register. "My pilot." "Why, your pilot's name? Hartley." "Captain Hartley." "What's this about?" "Give me a few minutes." Grant picked up his kit and walked toward Bay 7 without waiting for a response. Conrad looked at Vanessa. "What is he doing?" "No idea," she said. But she was watching Grant walk away with an expression that wasn't quite the dismissiveness she'd been performing. There was something underneath it, old, reflexive, quickly suppressed. Bay 7 held a citation latitude, mid-range, well appointed. Exactly the kind of aircraft a man like Conrad Sterling would use to transport investors to a deal site while making the transportation itself part of the impression. Captain Hartley was in the cockpit running through his checklist, mid-50s, precise, the kind of pilot who has been doing this long enough that preparation is a reflex rather than a discipline. He watched Grant approach with the wariness that any flight crew feels when an unknown arrives, with a purposeful expression during pre-flight. "Holloway Aeronautics," Grant said, identifying himself. Crouched beside the left main landing gear without ceremony and began his examination. "Pre-flight's completed," Hartley said carefully. "I know. I'm going to need you to hold the departure." Hartley came down the air stairs and crouched beside him. "What are you seeing?" Grant pointed. The actuator pin on the left main gear retraction assembly, a component that under normal operation would not draw attention from anyone who wasn't specifically looking, showed the faint but unmistakable signature of metal fatigue. A hairline. The kind of thing that doesn't cause a problem until it does, and when it does, it happens fast. Hartley went still. "How many flight hours since last inspection?" Grant asked. 42. Hartley straightened up. "I should have caught that. It's at the edge of visible. You'd need to know where to look." Grant stood. "But I need to red tag the aircraft until that component is replaced. I can have a crew here within the hour." Hartley nodded, already pulling out his phone. "I'll inform the passengers." "I'll inform the passengers," said a voice from behind them. Conrad Sterling had followed him to Bay 7, along with 2 of his associates and Vanessa. He stood at the bottom of the air stairs with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man whose schedule has been interfered with by someone who has no business interfering with it. "What's happening?" he demanded. "There's a component issue on the landing gear," Grant said. "The aircraft is grounded until it's repaired." Grounded. Conrad said the word like it was in a language he didn't speak. "We have a meeting in Tucson in 4 hours. There are investors on this flight." "I understand." "Then unground it." Grant looked at him with the patience of a man who has explained technical realities to non-technical people many times and has made a philosophical accommodation with the experience. "Mr. Sterling, the component I'm looking at is a load-bearing element of the retraction assembly. If it fails during flight, you lose gear function. That's a manageable emergency with a competent crew, but it's an emergency. If it fails on landing, you're looking at a potential gear collapse." The silence that followed had a specific texture. "How likely is failure?" One of Conrad's associates, a man with an accountant's eyes and a portfolio manager's suit, asked, "On this flight? Probably not." Grant paused. "But I can't tell you it's safe, and I won't." Conrad's jaw tightened. "Who authorized you to inspect this aircraft?" "I don't need authorization to conduct a safety inspection on this field." "You absolutely do. This is a privately arranged charter. You have no jurisdiction here. This airfield operates under FAA oversight. Any qualified inspector can flag an airworthiness concern. You're a maintenance worker. I'm a certificated airframe and power plant mechanic with inspection authorization." The flag stands. Conrad turned to Hartley. "Tell this man to stand down." Hartley, to his credit, to the considerable and immediate credit of a man who understands exactly who he is in the hierarchy of an aviation safety dispute, said, "Sir, if an AI-authorized inspector has flagged the aircraft, I'm not going to override that." "Can't. Then I'll find someone who can." Conrad pulled out his phone. Grant walked back to where he'd left his kit, crouched down, and continued his work. He was not nervous. He had been in situations like this before, not identical, but structurally similar, the geometry of a powerful man pressing against a technical reality and discovering that technical realities do not press back, they simply remain. Vanessa had stayed near the edge of the group. She was watching Grant in a way she probably didn't realize was visible, or maybe she did realize and had decided it didn't matter. "You're really doing this," she said, not accusatory, almost wondering. "I'm doing my job," Grant said. "You're grounding Conrad's flight in front of his investors. I'm grounding an aircraft with a compromised component. You understand how this looks." He glanced up at her. "It looks like a compromised aircraft is on the ground instead of in the air. That's what it looks like." She opened her mouth, closed it. The expression that crossed her face was complicated, in the way that things are when multiple things are true simultaneously, and none of them are comfortable. Conrad was on his phone 10 feet away, his voice low and controlled and very, very cold. Grant caught fragments on the field. Claims Inspector Authority. "I need someone who can override." He let the words go. The actuator pin existed independently of Conrad Sterling's phone call. Raymond Chu arrived at the airfield at 4:17, which was earlier than Grant had expected. He came across the tarmac with the measured pace of a man who has been informed of a situation and has not yet decided how urgently to treat it. He was carrying a leather portfolio and wearing a jacket that, unlike Grant's, did not have oil on the sleeve. He took in the scene: Grant crouched by the aircraft, Conrad Sterling pacing with a phone, the cluster of investors, Vanessa standing slightly apart with the swift, comprehensive assessment of someone who has been reading rooms professionally for 30 years. He came to Grant first. "The component?" Raymond said quietly. "Actuator pin on the left main. Fatigue cracking." "How bad?" "Bad enough." Raymond nodded, accepting this with the completeness of a man who trusts the source. He straightened up, turned, and walked toward Conrad. "Mr. Sterling, Raymond Chu. I'm the operating partner at Holloway Aeronautics." Conrad stopped pacing. "Your mechanic has grounded my aircraft. Our inspector identified an airworthiness concern. Yes, I want it overridden." Raymond looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has heard this sentence before, in various forms, from various mouths, and has never found it more or less legitimate than it was the first time. "That's not something we're able to do. I'll have this man's certifications. Mr. Sterling." Raymond's voice was quiet, pleasant, and entirely immovable. "I understand you're frustrated. You have a time-sensitive meeting, and this has complicated your plan significantly. That's genuinely unfortunate." He paused. "But the aircraft is grounded. Our crew will have the component replaced within the hour. If you'd like to discuss alternative transportation arrangements in the interim, I'm happy to help facilitate that." Conrad looked from Raymond to Grant and back. The calculation happening behind his eyes was visible in the way that calculations become visible when the person doing them is under pressure. "Who owns this airfield?" he asked. "Harlow Point is privately operated," Raymond said. "The lease on the hangars in use today, including this bay, is held by Holloway Aeronautics." Conrad stilled. Raymond continued almost conversationally. "Grant is, of course, the founder of Holloway Aeronautics. The engineers you see working on the field today are his team." He said it without emphasis, which was its own kind of emphasis. The accountant-eyed associate made a sound that was very small and very telling. Vanessa had gone quiet in a way that was different from her earlier quiet. That earlier quiet had been the comfortable quiet of a woman maintaining position. This was the quiet of recalibration. Conrad looked at Grant crouched beside a landing gear assembly in a jacket with oil on the sleeve, hair slightly disordered from the wind, and Grant looked back at him with no expression in particular. "You own this field," Conrad said. It wasn't quite a question. "I lease 2 hangars on this field," Grant said. "The aircraft that your investors have been looking at this week, the one with the modified winglet design, is ours. The certification we're expecting next quarter is ours." He stood up. "The component I just flagged is a standard airworthiness call. It doesn't change because of who owns what." One of Conrad's investors, a woman who had not spoken until now, who had been listening with the focused attention of someone who evaluates information for a living, stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "Lenora Blackwood. I've been following Holloway Aeronautics for some time." She extended her hand. Grant shook it. "I had a meeting request pending with your office," she said. "I know. I've been meaning to respond. Perhaps we can find time this week." "I think we can," Grant said. Conrad stood very still. The wind moved across the tarmac. Somewhere on the north side of the field, an engine turned over, settled, ran. Grant picked up his kit, walked to where his crew was waiting, and began organizing the repair. He did not look back at Vanessa. He didn't need to. The repair crew finished at 6:11, which Grant knew because he checked his watch when Captain Hartley signed off on the component replacement and cleared the aircraft for flight. It was a clean repair, a straightforward actuator pin replacement that his senior technician Marcus had completed with the efficiency of a man who has done this work long enough that competence looks like casualness. The citation was airworthy. The immediate problem was resolved. The immediate problem was not, however, the only problem. Conrad's Sterling had spent the intervening hour making phone calls at the far edge of the tarmac with the compressed energy of a man who has been embarrassed in front of people whose opinions constitute a professional liability. Grant had watched him peripherally, not with satisfaction, not exactly, but with the attention he gave to anything that represented an unresolved variable in his environment. Lenora Blackwood had not left. That was notable. Conrad's other associates had retreated to a waiting area inside the terminal building, but Lenora had stayed near Bay 7, watching the repair with the focused interest of someone who finds the operational details of a thing more revealing than its presentation. She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair she wore without apparent effort, and the kind of posture that came from decades of sitting at tables where the stakes were real. When Marcus gave the all-clear and the crew began packing equipment, she approached Grant with her hands in her coat pockets and the direct manner of a woman who has learned that indirection wastes time she could spend deciding things. "You trained your crew well," she said. Marcus trained himself. "I just stopped getting in his way." She considered this. "How long has Holloway Aeronautics been operating at this field?" 6 years at Harlow Point, 9 years total, and the modified winglet design, the one you mentioned to Mr. Sterling. That's the Meridian certification project? Grant looked at her more carefully. "You've done your research. I do my research before I get on planes and before I consider where to put money. Consistent policy." She paused, the certification timeline. "You said next quarter. Is that realistic? We've had 2 regulatory reviews without a significant flag. The 3rd is scheduled for December. If December goes the way the first 2 went, we file in January and receive certification by March. And if December doesn't go the way the first 2 went, then I find out what the problem is and fix it." He said it without drama, the way a person states an intention they've made so many times it no longer requires emphasis. Lenora made a sound that might have been the beginning of a smile. "I've been watching your company from a distance for about 14 months, she said. "What I've seen suggests a technical operation that's consistently ahead of where its funding profile should allow it to be. That's either very good management or very good luck. Usually it's very good people who work too many hours. Do you have a CFO? I have Raymond, who functions as one while technically being a general partner. We've been discussing whether to formalize that. You should formalize it." She drew a card from her coat pocket and held it out. "I'd like to schedule a proper meeting, not a tarmac conversation, a sit-down, with your financials and your certification roadmap." Grant took the card. "My assistant will reach out." "I'd prefer you reached out directly. Assistants filter things that shouldn't be filtered." He looked at the card, then at her. "All right." She nodded, satisfied. Not warm exactly, but the satisfaction of a person who has made a decision and confirmed it, and walked toward the terminal. Grant put the card in his jacket pocket, next to the pen he always carried and never remembered to refill, and went to find Raymond. Raymond was in the operations office in Hangar 2, standing at the window with a coffee he'd gotten from somewhere and hadn't drunk, watching the tarmac with the expression he wore when he was processing a situation that had more dimensions than he'd anticipated. "Lenora Blackwood," he said when Grant came in. "She gave me her card." "She doesn't give people her card. She has her people give people her card." Raymond turned from the window. "She sat on the tarmac for an hour and a half and watched Marcus replace an actuator pin. She's thorough. She manages a fund with something north of $2 billion in assets. She's been in aviation investment for 20 years. If she's looking at us directly—" Grant, he stopped. "How did she end up at Harlow Point today?" "She was with Sterling's group." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "Vanessa's new man." "Yes, and Vanessa was here." "Yes." Raymond turned back to the window. This was something Grant appreciated about him, the ability to receive complicated information and sit with it, rather than immediately converting it into advice or commentary. After a moment he said, "How was that?" "Fine." "You don't have to say fine." It was what it was. Grant sat down in the chair across from Raymond's desk, a chair that had a crack in the armrest from when someone had dropped it moving offices 4 years ago. He'd never replaced it either. She looked good. She looked different. Sterling talked to me like I was a valet for about 10 minutes before he realized what was happening. And then he realized what was happening. Raymond turned to face him. "You didn't let me know you were going to red tag his aircraft." "I didn't know I was going to red tag his aircraft until I looked at the actuator pin. You could have flagged it quietly and let the field crew handle it." Grant looked at him. "Could I have a pause?" Raymond picked up his coffee, looked at it, set it down. "No," he said, "probably not. The component was compromised. The aircraft was grounded. Everything else about that situation is secondary." I know it is." Raymond rubbed the back of his neck. "I just want to make sure you know that Conrad Sterling is going to go home tonight and start looking for ways to make our lives difficult. Men like that don't process humiliation, they redirect it. Let him look. Grant, Raymond, our documentation is clean. Our certifications are current. Our lease is ironclad. If he wants to find a pressure point, he's going to spend a lot of time and money finding out we don't have one. Everyone has a pressure point, then he'll find ours." Grant shrugged a small, genuine shrug, not dismissal but acceptance. "But the pin was cracked, and I wasn't going to approve the flight. That's the beginning and end of my decision." Raymond studied him for a long moment, with the look he sometimes had, the one that Grant had eventually decoded as a mixture of genuine respect and the particular weariness of a person who works closely with someone whose moral clarity is on a practical level occasionally exhausting. "Okay," Raymond said. "Okay," Grant agreed. Outside, the tarmac was doing what tarmac does in late afternoon light, absorbing the angle of the sun and throwing it back warmer than it arrived. 2 of Grant's technicians were running a post-repair check on the Citation. Captain Hartley was in the cockpit. Somewhere on the other side of the field, Conrad Sterling was either on his phone or in his car or both. Grant thought about the actuator pin, thought about what happens at altitude, at speed, at the moment of gear deployment, when a component that has been quietly failing finally finishes the job. He thought about the investors on that flight, people who had no idea what the man they were traveling with had almost put them into. He picked up his own phone and called Paige to let her know he'd be late for dinner. Conrad Sterling was, in certain rooms, genuinely impressive. Grant came to understand this not from personal experience. His personal experience of Conrad was limited and had peaked at the actuator pin, but from the architecture of what Conrad had built. Sterling Crest Holdings occupied 12 floors of a glass tower in downtown Phoenix and had, by all available accounts, generated significant returns for its investors over a 15-year run. Conrad had a reputation for seeing market positions before they were obvious and moving into them with the confidence of a man who was sometimes wrong but never uncertain. What Grant learned over the following 2 weeks was that Conrad had also been watching Holloway Aeronautics. The first indication came from Marcus, who mentioned, without apparent significance, that a man he didn't recognize had been asking questions of the Harlow Point field manager about the terms of Holloway's hangar lease. The second indication came from Raymond, who found that a request had been made through an intermediary for access to the preliminary documentation on the Meridian Certification Project documentation that was proprietary and not available. through any channel Raymond could identify as legitimate. The third indication came from Grant's attorney. Her name was Diana Cho, and she called him on a Thursday morning while he was in the truck with Paige's empty water bottle rattling around in the passenger footwell. She was methodical and undramatic in the way that good attorneys are, and she said, without preamble, that she'd received a filing inquiry from a law firm representing a company called Crestline Technical Partners. Grant didn't know the name, he said so. It's a subsidiary, Diana said, 2 layers removed from Sterling Crest Holdings. He pulled over into a parking lot of a dry cleaner and sat with the engine running. What's the nature of the inquiry? He asked. They're asserting prior development rights on a materials application process that they claim predates your patent filing by 8 months. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who has been surprised. It was the silence of a man who is translating a sentence from one language into another, from legal framing into technical reality, and doing the translation carefully. Which application process, he asked. The composite layering method. The one in the Meridian project. Grant looked at the dry cleaner. A woman inside was lifting something large and plastic-wrapped from a rack. Normal, precise, unrelated to any of this. That's not possible, he said. I know your filing history, Diana said. I'm telling you what they're asserting. Possible is what we're going to spend the next several weeks determining. When did Crestline Technical Partners incorporate? Pause the sound of papers. 14 months ago. And when do they claim their prior development work began? 26 months ago. Grant did the arithmetic. So they're claiming development work that predates their own incorporation. That's the problem with their timeline. Yes. Diana's tone was the careful neutral of an attorney who is managing her own reaction to a situation she finds professionally offensive. This isn't going anywhere on its merits, Grant. But the filing itself creates a cloud on the patent application, which delays the Meridian certification, which delays the January filing by at minimum 4 months. Possibly more. He sat in the parking lot for another moment. Then he said, how did they get details about the application process? Diana was quiet. The description in their filing, Grant said. How specific is it? Specific enough to suggest someone had access to technical documentation, internal documentation, or public filing information. The level of detail suggests something beyond what's in the public filings. Grant put his hand on the steering wheel and kept it there. He thought about the request Raymond had found the intermediary, the proprietary documentation, the channel that shouldn't have existed. Someone gave them our internal documentation, he said, Ed. That's my read, yes. I need you to find out who. I'm already working on it. He thanked her, ended the call, and sat in the parking lot of the dry cleaner for 4 more minutes thinking about a man in a well-fitted suit who had watched an actuator pin get replaced and decided, somewhere in the calculation that followed, that the best response was to take what he couldn't outbuild. He told Raymond that evening. Raymond's response was to sit very still for approximately 30 seconds, which was Raymond's version of an intense emotional reaction. Composite layering method, Raymond said finally. Yes, that's the core of the Meridian project. I know. There's a patent dispute on that. The certification stalls. The partnership stalls. Lenora Blackwood's meeting next month becomes, I know, Raymond. Raymond stood up, walked to the window of his own office, a different window from the operations office, this one looking at the parking lot of the building they leased downtown, and stood there with his hands in his pockets. How did they get the documentation? It wasn't a question the way he said it. It was the beginning of working backward. I have a short list, Grant said. How short? 3 people who had access to the full technical package. You, me, and Marcus. You, me, Marcus. And whoever Marcus showed it to during the Meridian presentation prep. Grant paused. And anyone who had access to my server before I changed the encryption protocol in September. Raymond turned from the window. When did you change the encryption protocol? September 14th. And when did Sterling's group first contact Harlow Point about the lease terms? Grant watched him do the arithmetic. September 19th, he said. Raymond's expression did something complicated. So they got access before the lockdown, before you'd identified them as a threat, because they weren't one yet. That's my working assumption. Who do you think it was? On our end. Grant was quiet for a moment. This was the part of the situation he'd been sitting with for 6 hours, not the legal problem, which was solvable, but the human problem, which was slower and uglier and required a different kind of work. I don't know yet, he said. I'd rather be certain before I say a name. Raymond accepted this. It was one of the things about their partnership that had lasted 9 years. Raymond didn't press Grant for certainty before it existed. "What do you need?" Raymond asked. "I need Diana to file a counter-inquiry that forces them to produce their development records. If they don't have legitimate records, and they don't, because the work doesn't exist, they'll either stall or withdraw. And if they stall, then we build the case that the documentation they have was obtained improperly, and the assertion is based on stolen materials. That's not a patent dispute anymore. That's theft." Raymond nodded slowly. "And Conrad Sterling's name is on the parent company." "2 layers removed," Grant said. "But yes." The office was quiet. Outside, a car passed in the parking lot, its headlights sweeping the window and moving on. "You should have let someone else flag the aircraft," Raymond said. Not accusatory. Almost gentle, Grant said. "I shouldn't have. If you hadn't been the one to ground his flight, then Lenora Blackwood wouldn't have been standing on that tarmac for an hour and a half watching Marcus work. And she wouldn't have given me her card. And she wouldn't have scheduled a meeting for the 14th. Raymond blinked. "You think that's going to matter? I think Lenora Blackwood has been in aviation investment for 20 years, and she's never made a decision based on a deck and a handshake." Grant stood up. "She wanted to see how we work when something goes wrong. She saw it." Raymond stopped. "That's either a very sophisticated read of the situation or a very convenient one." "Maybe both," Grant said. "I'll let you know in about 3 weeks." He didn't sleep especially well that night. This was not unusual. Grant's relationship with sleep had always been negotiable, subject to renegotiation whenever a problem was unresolved and his brain decided it preferred to keep working rather than switch off. He lay in the dark and thought about composite layering methods and patent timelines and a 14-month-old subsidiary company with a claimed development history that started 2 months before it existed. He thought about who had access to the server. He thought about a conversation he'd had 8 months ago with a man named Derek Paulson, a junior engineer who had left Holloway Aeronautics in April for a position at a company he'd described vaguely as a new opportunity in the Phoenix market. Grant had wished him well and meant it. The departure had been cordial and professional, and Grant had thought nothing more about it. Derek Paulson had been one of 4 people with full technical package access during the Meridian project's development phase. Grant made a note on his phone at 2:18 in the morning and then lay in the dark and made himself stop working and close his eyes. Because Paige had a school event at 7:30, and she needed him functional and present, and some things took priority over even the things that felt most urgent. Vanessa called on a Friday. He almost didn't pick up, not because he was avoiding her, but because he was in the middle of running a load calculation, and his phone was across the room, and the number registered a half second after he'd already decided not to move. Then he looked at the name and got up. "Grant," she said. "Vanessa." A pause. The kind of pause that happens when someone has prepared what they want to say, and then in the moment of saying it, finds that the preparation has gone slightly sideways. She stopped. "Is this a bad time?" "I have a few minutes. I wanted to call about what happened at the airfield." He leaned against the edge of the workbench and waited. "Conrad was out of line," she said. "The things he said. The way he talked to you. I should have another stop. I didn't handle it well either." "No," Grant said. "You didn't." The honesty seemed to land on her like something physical. He wasn't cruel about it, it was simply accurate. "I know," she said quietly. "I know I didn't." He didn't fill the silence. He'd learned, in the years of their marriage and in the years since, that Vanessa had a tendency to say what she meant only after she'd been through everything she thought she meant, and interrupting the process didn't help anyone. "You were doing your job," she said. "You found a problem, and you fixed it. She paused. "That's what you always did. And I used to think it meant you weren't ambitious, that you were just content to be useful. I said that once. Do you remember?" "I remember." "It was a terrible thing to say." "It was honest," he said. "Which is different from terrible." "It was both," she said. Simultaneously, he almost smiled. "Fair." The silence that followed was different from the earlier ones, less loaded, more like the silences that used to exist between them in the early years, when they were comfortable enough to not fill every pause with sound. "How's Paige?" Vanessa asked. "Good, she's good. She's got an academic showcase next month, her engineering project. She told me. She said you've been helping her with the stress calculations. She didn't need much help. I mostly just confirmed what she'd already figured out." Vanessa made a sound that he couldn't quite read. "She gets that from you." "The engineering?" the not needing confirmation. He looked at the window of his office, the one facing the parking lot, like Raymond's, which meant they had identical views of a loading dock and 3 parking spaces marked restored. "What are you calling about, Vanessa?" A long pause. "I'm not sure I know," she said. "I think I needed to say I was sorry. And to tell you that what he did at the airfield, I didn't know about the documentation. Whatever he's doing with the filing." Grant went still. "How do you know about the filing?" "I heard him on the phone. I wasn't trying to listen. He was in the next room." Her voice was careful. "I don't know the details, but I heard Holloway and I heard Patent and I heard someone say if the timeline holds." "When was this?" "Wednesday night, 2 days ago, before Diana had called him." Grant. Her voice had changed something underneath the careful composure. "What's he doing?" "Nothing I can't handle," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now." She was quiet for a moment. "Then he's not a bad person. I want you to know I don't think he's a bad person. But he needs to win. It's not a preference. It's structural for him. And when something gets in the way of winning, he finds a way around it," Grant said. "Yes, I appreciate you telling me," he said. And then, because it was true, "I appreciate you calling." After she hung up, he stood at the workbench for a while, not working. The load calculation was still on the screen in front of him, half finished, waiting with the patient neutrality of math for him to come back to it. He thought about Vanessa at the airfield, the camel coat, the careful distance she'd kept, the way she'd looked at him when Conrad wasn't watching. He thought about a filing with a fabricated timeline, and a junior engineer who'd left for a vague opportunity in the Phoenix market, and a man who needed to win structurally, constitutionally, as a matter of how he was built. Then he picked up his phone and texted Diana, subpoena the employment records for Derek Paulson, former address in Scottsdale. Also look for any consulting agreements between Paulson and any Sterling entity in the last 18 months. He sent the text, put the phone down, and went back to the load calculation. The math was patient. It could wait. Diana Cho had a particular way of delivering good news that made it sound like a warning, which Grant had eventually decided was not a personality flaw, but a professional adaptation, the result of 20 years of watching good news become complicated before anyone had time to celebrate it. She called on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Grant had sent the text about Derek Paulson, and she said, "We have the consulting agreement." Grant was in the kitchen making coffee. He set the mug down. "Clean, is it?" he asked. "Clean enough to be damaging." Paulson signed a 6-month consulting agreement with a company called Meridian Technical Solutions, not the Meridian you're working with, different entity entirely, in November of last year. The agreement specifies, and I'm quoting, "provision of technical documentation related to composite materials applications in aviation manufacturing." He sold them the documentation. He provided it under a consulting agreement, which is how they'll try to frame it. Problem for them is that the documentation he provided was created during his employment at Holloway Aeronautics, which means it was your intellectual property when he took it, regardless of what his consulting agreement says. Diana paused. "There's also a non-disclosure agreement he signed when he joined your company, which he violated. Comprehensively." Grant picked up the mug and carried it to the window that looked out on the backyard, the one with the oak tree Paige had climbed so often as a child that a particular branch had been worn smooth. He stood there and thought about Derek Paulson. Mid-20s, good instincts, a little impatient, someone who wanted to move faster than the work allowed. Grant had understood that. He'd tried to give him room to move. "What's the connection between Meridian Technical Solutions and Sterling Crest?" he asked. "1 layer," Diana said. "Not 2, I was wrong about that." Crestline Technical Partners, the entity that filed the prior development claim, was incorporated by the same registered agent as Meridian Technical Solutions, 4 months after the consulting agreement with Paulson was signed. The architecture of it assembled in Grant's mind. Paulson had taken the documentation. The documentation had gone to a shell entity set up to receive it. That entity had generated the fraudulent development history. A second entity had filed the patent challenge using that history. And somewhere above all of it, 2 layers or 1 layer removed, was a man who needed to win and had decided that the most efficient path to winning was to take what someone else had built. "What do we file?" Grant asked. "We file a motion to dismiss the prior development claim based on fraudulent timeline and stolen foundational materials. Simultaneously, I'm sending a demand letter to Crestline, Meridian Technical Solutions, and Sterling Crest holding all three jointly liable for the IP theft. She paused. And I'm filing a complaint with the state bar against the attorney who notarized the development records, because those records contain signatures on documents that cannot physically have existed at the dates shown. Someone committed forgery. Someone committed forgery, Diana confirmed. And they did it sloppily, which is either because they were rushed or because they assumed no one would look this carefully. They assumed I'd settle, Grant said. That's my read. He thought about that. A man who had watched him crouch beside a landing gear assembly in an oil-stained jacket and drawn a set of conclusions from the image. The conclusions had led to a strategy. The strategy had a fatal flaw, which was that it was built on an assessment of Grant Holloway that was approximately 9 years out of date. How long until we have a hearing date? He asked. If I file today, we're looking at 6 to 8 weeks. Judge Harmon's docket is heavy, but she moves patent matters quickly. File today, Grant said. Already drafting, Diana said. He told Raymond over lunch sandwiches from a place 2 blocks from the downtown office that Raymond had been ordering from for so long that they knew his order without asking. Raymond listened without interrupting, which meant he was taking it seriously, because Raymond's default was to interrupt with questions. When Grant finished, Raymond sat with his sandwich for a moment. Paulson, he said, yes, I like Derek, so did I. Did you know he was... Raymond stopped. No, of course you didn't. I knew he was impatient. I knew he thought we were moving too slowly on commercialization. Grant folded the paper wrapping his sandwich had come in. I thought that was ambition. I didn't think it was a direction. There's a difference between ambitious and for sale, Raymond said. Sometimes it's a short distance. Raymond was quiet for a moment, processing this with the particular expression he got when something confirmed a cynicism he'd been trying not to have. What happens to him? That's mostly Diana's territory. The NDA violation is civil. The documentation theft could go either way depending on how the DA's office reads it. Grant shrugged, not indifference, just the acknowledgement that some outcomes were beyond his control to determine and therefore beyond his practical interest to dwell on. I'm more focused on the patent claim, which you'll win. Which will win. Yes, and Sterling, Grant looked at his coffee. Sterling signed off on an entity that filed a fraudulent patent claim using stolen materials. Whether he knew the materials were stolen depends on what Paulson told him and when. Diana will find out. If he knew, then it's not just a civil matter anymore. Raymond let that sit. He drank his coffee, set it down, picked up his sandwich. You know he's going to come at this aggressively. When the filing hits, he's going to push back hard. I expect that. I mean publicly. He's not going to let this play out quietly in a court filing. He's going to make noise. Grant looked at him. Let him make noise. Grant, if he starts talking to press, then we talk to Lenora Blackwood first. He said it evenly, without strategy showing on the surface. She's been in this industry for 20 years. She knows the difference between a man who makes noise and a man who has a case. Raymond studied him. You've been thinking about this. I've been thinking about everything. That's what I do at 2 in the morning. Have you considered sleeping? Paige asked me the same thing. Paige is smarter than both of us. Don't tell her that. She already suspects it. The meeting with Lenora Blackwood was scheduled for the 14th, and it happened on the 14th, which Grant noted because, in his experience, meetings with people at Lenora's level had a way of shifting under the pressure of other priorities. Came to the Holloway Aeronautics office downtown her choice, not his with one associate, a younger woman named Priya, who took notes with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned that the notes she took in rooms like this were the notes that mattered. Grant had the financials ready, the certification roadmap printed and projected, and a technical summary of the composite layering method that Diana had cleared for sharing. Raymond sat at Grant's right. Across the table, Lenora Blackwood sat with her hands folded and no visible agenda of her own. I should tell you up front, Grant said, before the first page of the presentation, that there's an active patent dispute related to the Meridian project. Lenora didn't move. A prior development claim was filed against the composite layering method 3 weeks ago by an entity called Crestline Technical Partners, Grant continued. Our legal team is filing a motion to dismiss based on fraudulent timeline and misappropriated documentation. We expect the claim to be dismissed within 2 months. You expect, Lenora said. Or you know? The development records they filed contain fabricated dates on documents that can be forensically disproved. The foundational materials they used were taken from our systems by a former employee under circumstances that constitute an NDA violation and likely IP theft. We have the consulting agreement, the employee's access history, and documentation of the registered agent relationship connecting the filing entity to Sterling Crest Holdings. He said Sterling Crest Holdings the way he said most things without emphasis, as a neutral fact. Priya's pen had stopped moving. Lenora studied him for a moment. You're telling me this now because you assumed I'd find out. I'm telling you now because you're considering a significant investment and you deserve the complete picture. The dispute complicates the certification timeline by approximately 4 months. That's real. I'm not going to frame it otherwise. What's the revised timeline? July filing. Certification by October. Original was March. Yes. She was quiet. The particular quiet of a person who is doing actual work behind an empty expression. The entity you mentioned, she said. Sterling Crest Holdings. Yes, Conrad Sterling's company. Yes, who is also my ex-wife's partner. Yes. Grant said it straightforwardly. The way you say something that is complicated but not shameful. I'm aware of how that looks. I've given you the documentation because I want you to judge the situation on evidence, not on the way it looks. Lenora picked up the technical summary. She read it, not scanned it, read it, which Grant noticed, which told him something he'd already suspected but appreciated having confirmed. She read for 2 minutes, set it down, and asked 3 questions about the layering method that were specific enough to indicate she had either an engineering background or had been doing significant homework. Grant answered all 3 without consulting Raymond or the projector. After the 3rd answer, Lenora glanced at Priya, something passing between them too quickly to read. I've reviewed your filing history, Lenora said. Your original patent applications. The development timeline is documented in your own records. The certification review notes from the first 2 FAA examinations. She paused. The work is legitimate. The timeline is yours. If what you're describing about the Crestline filing is accurate, it's accurate. I can have Diana send the full evidentiary package to your legal team today. Do that. She folded her hands again. I'm going to be direct with you, Mr. Holloway. Please. I was at Harlow Point because Conrad Sterling invited me. He's been positioning Sterling Crest as a potential investor in aviation technology, and he knew I had interest in the sector, and he wanted to put himself in the same room with me and with a relevant opportunity. She said it without apparent judgment. What he didn't tell me was that the opportunity he was loosely associated with through your certification project was one he was simultaneously trying to undermine. Grant kept his expression neutral. That's a problem, she said, with the specific dryness of a woman who finds that word adequate. It's a significant one, Raymond said, from Grant's right. What it tells me, Lenora continued, is that Conrad's assessment of his own position in this sector is not accurate, and that his methods when his position is threatened are not ones I want associated with anything I'm connected to. She looked at Grant directly. The 4-month delay is manageable. The integrity of the foundational work is what I'm evaluating. And from what I've seen today, that's intact. It is, Grant said. Then I'd like to continue this conversation. I'll have my legal team review the evidentiary package. Assuming it aligns with what you've described, I'd like to come back in 2 weeks for a more detailed conversation about investment structure. Grant nodded. We'll have everything ready. She stood. Priya closed her notebook. They shook hands across the table. Lenora's grip was firm, practical, the handshake of someone who has decided something, rather than someone who is still considering. After they left, Raymond sat back in his chair and released a breath that he had apparently been holding for some portion of the meeting. She's in, he said. She's interested, Grant said. That's different. She said investment structure. She's a careful person. 2 weeks is 2 weeks. But he felt it too, the specific quality of a door that is opened, rather than one that has merely been knocked on. Get Diana to send the package today. Already texting her, Raymond said, phone in hand. The noise Conrad made was not, as Raymond had predicted, directed at the press. It came through a different channel, a letter from Sterling Crest's legal team, addressed to Holloway Aeronautics, asserting that Grant's red tag of the citation at Harlow Point had been conducted without proper authorization and had resulted in a breach of contract with the charter operator, and seeking damages that the letter quantified at a number that was large enough to be symbolic and small enough to be insulting. Grant sent the letter to Diana. Diana responded to Sterling Crest's legal team with the airfield's operational regulations, Grant's inspector authorization documentation, Captain Hartley's signed statement confirming the airworthiness concern, and a note that the charter operator had, in fact, thanked Holloway Aeronautics for the inspection in writing 3 days after the incident. The letter from Sterling Crest's legal team was not followed by a second letter. But the situation wasn't done. Grant understood that. Conrad Sterling was a man who operated on multiple fronts simultaneously, not because he was especially strategic, but because he was constitutionally incapable of accepting a position that was losing and waiting for the position to change. He would keep moving. The question was which direction. The answer came from an unexpected source. Marcus appeared in Grant's office on a Wednesday afternoon. Marcus, who came to Grant's office approximately never, preferring to communicate through work orders and the occasional terse verbal exchange in the hangar, and stood in the doorway with the expression of a man who has something to say and is working out how to say it. "You need to sit down," Grant said. "I'm fine standing." "Then talk." Marcus came in, closed the door, and stood with his arms crossed, not defensive, just the posture of a man who is load-bearing. "Someone called the FAA district office," he said. "Anonymous tip. Claimed that the Holloway Aeronautics team at Harlow Point has been approving aircraft with incomplete inspections." The room was very quiet. "When?" Grant asked. "Call came in Monday. I found out this morning from a contact at the field manager's office." Marcus held his gaze. "They're going to send an examiner." "When?" "They didn't give a date. That's standard, they don't announce." Grant leaned back in his chair. Thought about the actuator pin. He thought about 11 years of documentation, 11 years of inspection records, 11 years of his team doing work that met and frequently exceeded what was required, because Grant Holloway had built the company on the operational philosophy that in aviation, corners did not exist to be cut. When the examiner comes, Grant said, they will have access to everything. Every record, every inspection log, every sign-off. He looked at Marcus. "Is there anything in our records that gives me reason to be concerned?" Marcus looked at him with the flat, certain expression of a man who has been doing this work for 22 years. "No," he said. "Then let the examiner come." Grant, an anonymous tip creates a record that someone filed an anonymous tip. After the examination, that record will sit next to an examination report that finds nothing. Grant straightened in his chair. "That's actually better for us than not having been examined." Marcus looked at him for a moment. "You think he filed the tip?" "I think someone did. If Sterling filed a false tip with the FAI, then Diana will add it to the evidentiary package." Grant shook his head. "He's swinging at everything, Marcus. That's not strategy. That's a man who's used to pressure working and finding that this time it isn't." Marcus uncrossed his arms. "I don't like it. I don't either. I want you to know the team doesn't like it. The guys in the hangar. They know something's going on, and they know it's connected to the airfield incident. Nobody said anything to me directly, but he stopped." Grant waited. "They want to know if the company's okay," Marcus said. "Some of them have been here a long time. They've got families." This was the part that didn't have a clean answer. Grant knew it, and Marcus knew it, and neither of them pretended otherwise. "Tell them the company is okay," Grant said. "Tell them we're dealing with a legal challenge that we're going to win, and that the operations side, their side, is clean and documented, and not in question. Tell them I said that directly. They'll ask if you mean it. Tell them I've never said something in this building I didn't mean." Marcus held his gaze for another moment, then nodded a short, decisive movement and left without further ceremony. Grant sat in his office after Marcus closed the door and looked at the window with the parking lot view and thought about 9 years. 9 years of early mornings and late nights and decisions made under pressure that he had to live with afterward. 9 years of Paige growing up in the background of all of it, watching her father from a distance, understanding pieces of it, not understanding others. 9 years during which Vanessa decided she was watching a man go nowhere. He thought about that without the bitterness he used to feel, which had surprised him when he'd first noticed its absence. The bitterness had been there for a while, present, but manageable, like the sound of a refrigerator you've stopped noticing. And then at some point it had stopped. He wasn't sure exactly when. Somewhere between building the thing she thought he'd never build and realizing that building it hadn't actually been about proving her wrong. It had just been about building it. The FAA examiner arrived on a Thursday, unannounced, which was standard. Her name was Carla Medina, and she had the methodical manner of a person who has conducted enough examinations to have stopped finding them interesting and started finding them simply necessary. She spent 4 hours at Harlow Point. She reviewed inspection logs going back 30 months. She spoke to Marcus, to two of the senior technicians, and briefly to Captain Hartley, who happened to be on the field that day preparing for a flight and who confirmed, when asked, that the inspection conducted by Holloway Aeronautics on his aircraft 6 weeks prior had identified a legitimate airworthiness concern and that the repair had been completed properly. At the end of 4 hours, she found Grant in the operations office. "Your documentation is thorough," she said. She said it without warmth, which was its own form of professional respect. "We try to be," Grant said. "I'm going to close the complaint as unsubstantiated." She looked at him with the direct assessment of someone who has seen this pattern before. "Whoever filed the tip wasn't familiar with your records." "That's my assessment too," Grant said. She left without further comment. Grant watched her car pull out of the Harlow Point lot and thought about Conrad Sterling, somewhere in Phoenix, waiting to hear what the examination had found. He thought about what it must feel like to keep swinging and keep missing. He didn't feel satisfaction exactly. It was more the quiet that follows when a noise you've been braced for doesn't come a release of readiness back into the normal register of a day. Called Raymond, examinations closed. Unsubstantiated. "Thank God," Raymond said. "Don't thank anyone yet. Going to try something else. You sound almost certain." "He needs to win, Raymond." Vanessa said it. "It's structural." Grant walked out of the operations office onto the tarmac, where the afternoon light was doing its mid-autumn thing with the angle and the warmth. He hasn't found the thing that works yet. He's going to keep looking. And when he finds it, he won't find it, because it doesn't exist. Grant put his hand in his jacket pocket and felt the pen, the notepad, the edge of Lenora Blackwood's card that he'd never transferred anywhere, because he'd never needed to once her number was in his phone. "But we're going to make sure it absolutely cannot exist, which means I need to do something I've been putting off." "What?" "I need to talk to Paige." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "How much does she know?" "Enough to have questions. Not enough to have the right ones." Grant started walking toward his truck. "She's 14 and she's smart, and she's going to hear something from Vanessa or see something somewhere, and I'd rather she hear the full version from me." "What's the full version?" Grant thought about it. Composite layering method and the patent filing and Derek Paulson and the FAA tip and Lenora Blackwood and Conrad Sterling and a man who had told him to carry bags across a tarmac while assuming that the jacket with oil on the sleeve was the complete picture. The full version, he said, is that someone tried to take something that wasn't theirs, and it isn't going to work. He got in the truck. The passenger window handle was still broken. He'd ordered a replacement part a week ago, and it was sitting on the kitchen counter at home, still in the packaging. He drove toward Paige's school, calculating as he always calculated, as he could not help calculating how many minutes he had, and what needed to be said, and in what order, and whether the fan in her room was still doing its slow, asthmatic rotation, and whether this weekend, finally, he'd have time to replace it. Paige was waiting on the front steps when he pulled into the driveway, which meant she'd seen him from her window and come down, which meant she'd been watching for him, which meant she already knew something was off. She was 14, and she had his eyes and Vanessa's instincts, and a particular talent for reading the temperature of a room that Grant had observed since she was approximately 7 years old. She didn't get it from him exactly. He read rooms the way he read technical schematics methodically, one component at a time. Paige read them the way some people hear music, all at once, the whole structure arriving simultaneously. She was sitting with her backpack beside her, even though she'd been home for an hour, which meant she hadn't gone inside yet, which meant she'd been outside long enough to want to be outside rather than in. "Mom called," she said, when he got out of the truck. Grant closed the truck door. "When?" "An hour ago. She said she needed to talk to me about something involving you, and she wanted to make sure I heard it from her first." Paige looked at him with an expression that was too careful to be neutral. "She didn't say much. She said there was a legal situation. She said you were handling it. She said she thought I should know." Grant sat down on the step beside her. The concrete was cold through his jacket. The oak tree in the yard was losing the last of its leaves in a slow, inattentive way, dropping them without drama into the grass. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "I told her I'd talk to you." "Good." She sounded. Paige stopped, chose the word deliberately. "Worried." About the legal situation? About you. She looked at him. Which is weird, right? They're not together. She doesn't usually. She stopped again. Never mind. Tell me what's happening. So he told her. He edited for age appropriateness in the places where the details were dry and technical, and he didn't edit at all in the places where the story was simply what it was. He told her about the patent filing and Derek Paulson and the documentation. He told her about the FAA tip and the examination. He told her about Lenora Blackwood and the meeting that had happened and the second meeting that was scheduled. He did not tell her how tired he was. That part was not useful information for a 14-year-old, and it was not, in the scheme of what needed to be managed, the most important part. When he finished, Paige sat with it for a moment, looking at the oak tree. Conrad did this, she said. It wasn't a question. Entities connected to Conrad. Whether he directed it specifically, or whether people around him made decisions, that's what Diana's working on. But you think it was him. I think he wanted to win, and he didn't have the right tools to do it legitimately, so he used the ones he had. Paige was quiet for another moment. How much does it matter? The delay. 4 months on the certification, which delays the partnership, which has financial implications, but nothing we can't manage. You tell me if it was serious. Yes, he said. She looked at him with the assessment of someone who has been evaluating the truthfulness of this particular person's reassurances for 14 years and has developed sophisticated detection equipment. Okay, she said finally. I believe you, thank you. Don't thank me. I'm just stating a fact. She picked up her backpack. Also, the fan in my room has been making a new sound for 3 days. Kind of a clicking thing. You should probably look at it. I have the replacement part on the kitchen counter. I know, I saw it. She stood up. Dad, it's been sitting there for 2 weeks. 8 days, it feels like 2 weeks. She went inside. Grant stayed on the step for another few minutes, alone with the oak tree and the cold concrete and the early dark that came in November like it had somewhere to be. The second meeting with Lenora Blackwood happened on a Friday, 3 weeks after the first. She brought Priya again and added a third person, a man named Wesley Traub, who was introduced as her fund's aviation sector specialist, mid-40s, technical enough that his questions during the presentation indicated he had read the certification documentation thoroughly, rather than summarizing it. The meeting ran 3.5 hours. Grant had not expected 3.5 hours. He had prepared for 90 minutes. Raymond had prepared for 2 hours. At the 2-hour mark, when it became clear that Lenora was not done, Raymond quietly excused himself, made 3 phone calls in the hallway to move his afternoon, and came back without mentioning it. They went through the financials in detail that Grant had not experienced since the company's second year, when he'd been negotiating a lease extension with a bank that was skeptical about the durability of a 9-person aviation company that had not yet turned a profit. Lenora asked questions that were specific and sequential and built on each other in a way that confirmed she had been doing significant work between the first meeting and this one. At one point, she set down the page she was holding and said, "Walk me through your decision to ground the citation at Harlow Point." Grant looked at her. That was 6 weeks ago. I know when it was. The actuator pin showed fatigue cracking at a level that compromised airworthiness. I flagged it. The captain held the departure, and my crew replaced the component. He paused. Was there a specific aspect of the decision you're asking about? The conflict of interest, Lenora said. Conrad Sterling was a man you had reason to dislike. His aircraft had a problem. You made the call that grounded his flight in front of investors. Was there any part of that decision that was influenced by the situation rather than by the component? The room was very quiet. No, Grant said. You're certain? I'm certain. If I'd seen the same component on an aircraft belonging to anyone else on that field, I'd have flagged it the same way. He met her gaze. I've red-tagged aircraft belonging to clients I like, people I've worked with for years, in situations where the timing was terrible for everyone. The component either meets airworthiness standards or it doesn't. That's the only variable I work with in those situations. Lenora studied him. Wesley Traub was making a note. Good, Lenora said, and returned to the financials. Grant understood after a moment that the question had been a test. Not a test of his integrity exactly, she'd already assessed that from the evidentiary package Diana had sent. It was a test of whether he would become defensive or whether he would answer cleanly. He had answered cleanly. She had moved on. By the end of the 3rd hour, the discussion had shifted from evaluation to structure. Lenora spoke in terms of tranches and equity percentages and milestone-linked disbursements, and Raymond wrote numbers on the legal pad he always carried. And Wesley Traub asked 3 more questions about the certification timeline that Grant answered without hesitation. 3 hours and 20 minutes, Lenora said, "I'd like to make a formal proposal. My legal team will draft something in the next 10 days. It will be preliminary subject to the patent dispute resolution, but it will give you a picture of what we're considering." "We'll review it," Grant said. "I want one thing clear," Lenora said. She looked at Grant, not at Raymond, not at the projector. "I'm not investing in the technology. I can find good technology. I'm investing in the way this company makes decisions when it's under pressure. That's what I came to assess, and that's what I've seen." She paused. "The technology is genuinely excellent, but it's the decision-making I'm paying for." Grant nodded. He didn't know what to do with the feeling that produced not pride exactly, because pride felt too simple for something that had cost as much as it had cost. It was closer to the feeling of having a calculation check out after you'd run it 3 times and weren't sure it would. "Thank you," he said. She shook hands with both of them and left with Priya and Wesley Traub, and the conference room settled into the particular silence of a space that has recently contained something significant. Raymond looked at his notepad. He looked at the numbers he'd written. He looked at Grant. "She said genuinely excellent," he said. "I heard her. Lenora Blackwood called our technology genuinely excellent." "Raymond, I'm processing." "Process faster. We have a 4:30 call with Diana." Raymond put the cap on his pen. "You're impossible to celebrate with. We haven't won anything yet. We haven't lost anything in about 6 weeks, despite someone systematically trying to make us lose things. That's worth 4:30, Grant said, and started gathering the presentation materials. Diana's 4:30 call contained news that she delivered in her warning-flavored way, which meant it was actually good. "Judge Harmon scheduled the hearing," she said. "December 9th. That's faster than I projected." "Why faster?" "Because she reviewed the preliminary filing and called opposing counsel directly. That's unusual. It means she looked at the timeline documentation they submitted and saw the problem herself before I had to argue it." "What did she say to opposing counsel?" "That's not something I'm privy to. What I know is that they filed a motion to extend the hearing date 2 days later, which Judge Harmon denied." Diana paused. "When a judge denies an extension request in a patent matter this early, it generally means she doesn't think there's a legitimate case to prepare. So she's already assessed it. I'm reading tea leaves. But they're pretty clear tea leaves." A pause. "There's something else. One of the attorneys from the firm representing Crestline contacted my office this morning. Off the record." "About what?" "They want to know if there's an opportunity to discuss resolution before the hearing." Grant sat back in his chair. "They want to settle. They want to know if settlement is on the table, which is different, but the direction is the same. What kind of resolution are they looking for? They didn't specify. My read is they want the hearing to go away, and they're hoping we want the same thing badly enough to offer terms that protect their client from the hearing record." Grant thought about this. He thought about what a settlement meant: the claim withdrawn, the certification timeline cleared, the Lenora Blackwood partnership moving forward without the cloud. It was what he'd wanted. It was available now, approximately, if he reached for it. He thought about Derek Paulson, about a consulting agreement signed in November, a shell company incorporated in February, a patent filing in October, about the documented sequence of deliberate choices made by people who had calculated that Grant Holloway wouldn't have the resources or the will to fight it all the way to a hearing. "Tell them," Grant said, "that we're willing to discuss a resolution that includes a full withdrawal of the prior development claim, a written acknowledgement that the foundational materials were improperly obtained, and a commitment to a separate process for determining damages related to the documentation theft." Diana was quiet for a moment. "They won't agree to a written acknowledgement. That's an admission." "I know. If they won't agree, we're back to the December 9th hearing. Then we're back to the December 9th hearing." Another pause. "You want the record, don't you?" "I want them to choose," Grant said. "They can acknowledge what happened privately in a resolution document, or they can have it established publicly in a hearing room in front of a judge who has already read their timeline and called their attorney. Those are the options. Grant a settlement without the acknowledgement still clears your timeline. It also leaves a company connected to Sterling Crest with no documented consequence for filing a fraudulent patent claim using stolen materials. Which means the next time Conrad Sterling needs to win something and someone gets in his way, he stopped. The acknowledgement matters. Diana breathed out slowly. Okay, I'll relay the terms. Thank you, Diana. You're going to make me earn my fee on this one. You've been earning it since September, he said, and meant it. The response from opposing counsel came in 4 days. They would not agree to a written acknowledgement. The hearing would proceed on December 9th. Grant had expected this. He told Raymond, who had also expected it, and they sat with it for a moment in the operations office at Harlow Point, while Marcus moved equipment in the hangar on the other side of the wall. Sterling's attorney thinks they can make a case at the hearing, Raymond said. They can make noise at the hearing. That's different from a case. Grant, even a strong dismissal takes time. If the hearing runs long and there's an appeal, there won't be an appeal. Their documentation is fabricated, and Diana has the forensic records to prove it. An appeal extends the exposure. It doesn't reduce it. Grant looked out at the tarmac. They're bluffing. You're sure? The attorney reached out to settle 4 days after the hearing was scheduled. You reach out to settle when you don't have what you need for the hearing. They don't have what they need. Raymond leaned against the window frame. And Sterling knows this. He knows it now. He may not have known it when the filing went in. Grant turned from the window. Someone, Paulson, the attorney, someone in the chain told him the timeline would hold up. It doesn't hold up. He's finding that out in real time. So what does he do? Grant shook his head. That's the part I don't know. Men like Sterling, when the legal thing stops working, when the regulatory thing stops working, they either accept the position and recalibrate, or they do something else entirely. He paused. And I don't know Conrad Sterling well enough to know which kind of man he is. He found out 3 days later, which was also the day the replacement fan arrived, the one he'd ordered, not the part from the kitchen counter, which had turned out to be the wrong model, and which was also the day Vanessa showed up at the Harlow Point airfield in her camel coat with the collar turned up against the December air, looking like someone who has made a decision and is committed to carrying it out before she can reconsider it. Grant was in the hangar when she arrived. Marcus appeared in the office doorway and said, simply, "Someone here for you," with the expression of a man who has made the correct identification and chosen not to editorialize. She was standing at the edge of the hangar entrance, not coming in, exactly, but not staying outside either, positioned in the threshold the way people stand when they're not sure of their welcome. "I should have called," she said. "You can come in," Grant said. Cold. She came in. She stood in the concrete space with the 2 aircraft on the far side and the equipment arranged with the precise disorder of a working operation, and she looked around in a way that told him she was, seeing it for what it was, maybe for the first time. "I've never been here," she said. "No. I knew you leased space at an airfield. I didn't—" She stopped. "I didn't think about what that meant." "What did you think it meant?" She looked at him. "I thought it meant you had a workspace. I didn't think it meant—" She gestured. A small movement that encompassed the hangar, the aircraft, the field visible through the entrance, the whole operational reality of the thing. This. Grant didn't say what was in his head, which was that this was what 9 years looked like when you were paying attention, and she hadn't been. He didn't say it because it was true in a way that was also not entirely fair, and he'd been trying, with mixed results, to stop framing it as her failure rather than a shared one. "What are you here for, Vanessa?" he asked. She turned to face him fully. She had the look of a woman who has rehearsed something and knows the rehearsed version isn't going to come out right and has decided to say it anyway. "Conrad knows about the hearing," she said. "He knows Diana has the consulting agreement and the registered agent documentation. His attorneys told him last week. I assumed. She pressed her lips together. He's been different since then. Since Harlow Point, actually, but worse since the attorneys told him. He goes quiet, and then he makes calls, and I can't tell what he's planning because he doesn't talk to me about it." She paused. "He asked me last week what I knew about your company, about your finances, about whether you had other investors." Grant went still. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. Told him I didn't know anything specific about your business." She met his eyes. "True. I don't. But he asked, Grant, and the fact that he asked, he's looking for leverage." "Yes." She said it quietly, like an admission. "And I think he might be looking somewhere that involves me. Involves things I might know about you personally. About Paige." She stopped. "I'm probably being paranoid." "Probably not," Grant said. The hangar was cold. Outside, one of the technicians was moving a fuel cart across the tarmac, its wheels audible on the surface. Why are you telling me this? Grant asked. Because it's the right thing to do, she said. Then, after a pause, and because I've been doing the wrong thing consistently for long enough that I needed to do one right thing. He looked at her. She didn't look away. He's not going to find leverage, Grant said. There isn't any. Paige is protected. My personal finances are clean. Everything in the company is documented. He paused. But if he contacts you again and asks questions about me or my business, I need you to tell Diana. Your attorney. Yes.
I know what he'd see it as.
Tell Diana anyway. Vanessa nodded slowly. She looked around the hangar again, at the aircraft, at the wall of organized equipment, at the board where Marcus tracked inspection schedules in his illegible handwriting. Paige told me about her engineering project, she said, with the shift in tone that happens when a conversation finds a lower register. She said you've been helping her. She doesn't need much help. She said you sat with her for 3 hours on Saturday, working through the stress calculations. The calculations were interesting. Grant. Vanessa's voice was complicated something in it that he recognized from the early years, before it had been replaced by other things. She's remarkable. I know. You did that. Whatever else you did that. He didn't know what to say to this, which was unusual. He was quiet for a moment. Then you did half of it. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I did less than half. She shook her head. I was somewhere else for a lot of it. He couldn't argue with that, so he didn't. I should go, she said. Be careful with him, Vanessa. She looked up at him. I know he's not dangerous in the way you mean, but he's in a position that's collapsing, and he doesn't process that well. He paused. Be careful. She left the way she'd come through the hangar entrance, back across the tarmac to wherever she'd parked. Grant watched her go, and then stood in the hangar for a moment with the cold and the equipment and the careful illegible writing on Marcus's schedule board. He called Diana. Vanessa Holloway, Vanessa Marsh, now may be contacted by Sterling looking for personal or financial information about me, he said. I've asked her to report any contact to you. Will she? I think so. Yes, okay, a pause. Grant, what's your read on his next move? I've been thinking about that. He walked to the hangar entrance, looked at the tarmac, the sky, the afternoon going gray at its edges. He's not going to find leverage that doesn't exist. He's not going to win at the hearing. His investors have already seen the situation at Harlow Point, and Lenora Blackwood is connected to the same network. He paused. I think his next move is to try to make the story about something other than the evidence. Meaning? Meaning he's going to try to make it personal. Make it about me, my credibility, my judgment, something that creates enough doubt that the hearing outcome seems less definitive. He thought about the FAA tip, the damage letter over the citation red tag, the intermediary who'd gone after the lease records. He's been making small moves. I think the next one is bigger. What do you want me to do? Keep building the evidentiary record. And get me everything you can find on Conrad Sterling's previous disputes. Anyone he's gone after this way before. Diana was quiet for a moment in the particular way that meant she was writing things down. I'll start tonight, she said. He ended the call and stood at the edge of the tarmac as the daylight finished leaving. The field lights were coming on one at a time across the airfield, yellow-white, steady, each one finding its brightness at its own pace. He thought about December 9th, which was 19 days away. He thought about Paige's academic showcase, which was the weekend after, and the stress calculations they'd worked through on Saturday, which were genuinely interesting, and the fan in her room, which he had the correct replacement part for now and intended to install before the weekend. He thought about Conrad Sterling making phone calls in the next room while Vanessa listened through the wall and decided which direction loyalty runs when the person you've chosen turns out to be a different shape than you thought. Some problems had solutions and some problems had outcomes. Grant had spent 9 years learning to tell the difference. He went back into the hangar, found Marcus, and asked him about the morning schedule, and Marcus told him, and they talked about it for 6 minutes. And then Grant drove home in the truck with the broken window handle and made dinner and installed the ceiling fan in Paige's room while she sat on her bed doing homework and periodically announced the name of the tool he needed before he asked for it. Flathead, she said without looking up. How did you know? Because you always need the flathead at this part, and you always forget where you put it. He found the flathead screwdriver in his left jacket pocket, which was where he'd put it without thinking. I didn't forget. It was in your pocket the whole time. That's not forgetting. That's Dad. She turned to Paige. Just say thank you. Thank you, he said. The new fan came on smooth and quiet when he tested it, a clean rotation, no clicking, no asthmatic protest. Paige looked up at it and then back at her homework without comment, which was its own form of satisfaction. The bigger move came on a Tuesday, 8 days before the hearing. It arrived not as a legal filing or a regulatory complaint, but as a piece of content, a post on a financial industry forum that had enough readership in the aviation investment sector to matter. The post was unsigned, attributed to an account with no history prior to that week, and it made 3 specific claims about Holloway Aeronautics: that the company's certification timeline had been misrepresented to potential investors, that the foundational technology had unresolved questions of original authorship, and that the company's founder had a pattern of using regulatory mechanisms as competitive weapons against business rivals. Grant read it at 6:40 in the morning at his kitchen table, having been sent the link by Raymond at 6:35 with no message attached, which was Raymond's way of indicating that he had opinions he was managing. He read it twice. The writing was careful, nothing explicitly false enough to constitute clear defamation, everything framed as concern or question rather than assertion. Someone had been deliberate about the construction. The 3 claims mapped precisely onto the 3 pressure points that had failed through other channels: the certification delay, the patent dispute, the citation red tag. It was the same strategy, different instrument. He called Raymond. Send it to Diana. Already did. 12 minutes ago. Who's seen it? I've counted 6 shares in aviation investment circles. It's not viral. But the people sharing it are the right people to damage us with. Has Lenora's office said anything? Not yet. It's early. Grant looked at the window. The backyard was gray and cold. The oak tree bare now, every leaf gone. What's your read? My read is that he's out of legitimate options and he knows it. Raymond paused. My read is also that this could do real damage if it sits for more than 24 hours without a response, because in this sector, questions about IP authenticity stick even after they're disproved. What do you want to do? I want you to call Lenora Blackwood directly, not through assistants. You call her, you tell her what this is, and you give her the same evidentiary package we gave her in the meeting before she hears about the post from someone else. Grant considered this. He was wearing the same jacket he wore most mornings at the kitchen table, not the green one from the airfield. A different one, older, with a pocket that had stopped closing properly. He'd been meaning to replace this one too. All right, he said. And Grant, when you call her, don't manage it. Just tell her. I don't manage things. You manage things constantly. You just do it so quietly that most people don't notice. A pause. She'll notice. He called Lenora at 7:15. She picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant she'd already seen it. I was going to call you, she said in place of a greeting. Then I'll save you the step, Grant said. You've seen the post. Priya sent it to me at 6:50. It's connected to the same entities Diana documented in the evidentiary package. Claims mirror the 3 avenues that failed through legal and regulatory channels. The account that posted it was created 5 days ago. He paused. I can't prove Conrad Sterling wrote it or ordered it. I can show you that it describes, in narrative form, the exact pressure points that Sterling-connected entities have been working against us for 2 months. I see that, Lenora said. She was quiet for a moment, not the evaluative quiet of the meetings, something more considered. The claim about misrepresenting the certification timeline. We disclosed the 4-month delay to you before you asked. In the first meeting, before the presentation began. I know, I was there. Another pause. The claim about original authorship. Diana has the forensic documentation establishing our development timeline. The hearing is in 8 days. Judge Harmon has already reviewed the preliminary record, and the regulatory mechanisms claim. Captain Hartley's statement is in the package. The FAA examination report is in the package. Both established that the citation inspection was a legitimate airworthiness call. Grant kept his voice level. I'm not going to tell you how to read this, Lenora. You've been in this industry 20 years. You know what a legitimate concern looks like, and you know what a coordinated pressure campaign looks like. Lenora was quiet for long enough that Grant could hear the background of wherever she was in office, ambient and muted. Grant, she said, I made a decision in our second meeting. I don't unmake decisions based on anonymous forum posts. She paused. But I want you to do something. What? I want you to respond to the post publicly. Not defensively. I don't want a rebuttal that reads like you're rattled. I want a statement that is factual, specific, and brief. 3 sentences maximum. Something that tells anyone reading it that you know exactly what's happening and you're not concerned about it. And if I'm concerned about it, then don't show it. That's not the same as lying. That's knowing which of your reactions are useful and which aren't. A pause. Can you write 3 sentences like that? I can write 3 sentences like that. Good. Send it to Priya before you post it. He drafted it at the kitchen table in 8 minutes, which was longer than 3 sentences should take, and shorter than they usually did when the stakes were real. He sent it to Priya. Priya sent back one word, perfect. He posted it under Holloway Aeronautics' company profile, flagged the post as a response to specific misinformation, and attached a link to the FAA examination summary that was part of the public record. Then he made a second cup of coffee and sat at the table and thought about the hearing, which was 8 days away, and about Page's academic showcase, which was 9 days away, and about a company that had started with a salvaged hangar lease and 1 engineer and $400, and it had arrived somehow here. Diana called the day before the hearing. Opposing counsel filed a withdrawal motion this morning, she said. Grant put down the technical manual he'd been reviewing. They're pulling the claim. They're withdrawing with prejudice, which means they can't refile it. They submitted a joint stipulation that acknowledges the prior development claim was based on incomplete documentation. She paused. They wouldn't agree to stolen. They got incomplete. And the damages process? Separate proceeding. They've agreed in principle to a negotiated resolution on the documentation misappropriation. That's going to take months, but the core issue, the patent challenge, is gone. The certification timeline is clear. Grant looked at the window. The Harlow Point tarmac, gray and still in the December light. What made them move? He asked. Judge Harmon's clerk called opposing counsel yesterday afternoon. Off the record, I'm told, though of course it's all on the record. She indicated the judge wanted to understand their evidentiary basis for the hearing scheduled for tomorrow and gave them until this morning to submit a supplemental briefing. Diana paused. They didn't have a supplemental briefing, so they withdrew. She forced their hand. She made it clear that proceeding to hearing without a legitimate evidentiary basis was not going to end well for anyone associated with the filing. A pause. Grant the withdrawn claim with prejudice, combined with the damages proceeding, combined with the forum post that Diana had now formally documented as part of an ongoing interference pattern. This is a significant record. Sterling decides to try anything else. He's doing it with this entire history in front of any court or regulatory body that looks at it. He won't try anything else, Grant said. You sound sure. He's a smart man. He made a wrong calculation about who I was and what I had. He's corrected the calculation. Grant stood, walked to the hangar entrance, looked at the field. He's not done being who he is, but he's done with this particular project. Diana was quiet for a moment. You're not angry at him. It wasn't quite a question. I was, Grant said, for a while. Not at him specifically, at the situation, at having to spend 3 months on this instead of on the work. He paused. But angry doesn't get the certification filed. Most people would be angrier longer. Most people didn't have Page's academic showcase to get ready for tomorrow, he said. Diana laughed, a real one. Short, slightly surprised, which was the best kind. Congratulations, Grant. This was a hard 3 months. It was, he said. Thank you for the work you did. Send me the invitation to the partnership signing. When it happens, you'll be the first call, he said. He told Raymond by text, which was the wrong medium for news this size, and also exactly right for 2 people who had worked together long enough that the excess of words would have been its own kind of awkward. The text said, claim withdrawn with prejudice. Timeline clear. Raymond's response came back in 40 seconds, about time. Dinner Friday. Grant texted back, yes. He told Marcus in person, in the hangar, because Marcus had stood in his office and delivered the news about the FAA tip, with the weight of a man who understood what it meant for the people who worked there, and he deserved to hear the resolution the same way. Marcus listened, nodded once with the compressed satisfaction of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing to be confirmed, and said, good, because the Vanderburg inspection is Thursday, and I needed you focused. I'm focused, Grant said. You've been distracted for 3 months. I've been focused on 2 things at once. Same thing for you. Marcus picked up his clipboard. Thursday, 8 a.m., Grant said. Page's academic showcase was on a Saturday in the gymnasium of her school, which had been transformed with the specific ambitious energy of a faculty that genuinely believed in the project and a student body that was trying to match that energy while also being 14 and 15 and therefore obligated to perform occasional indifference. Paige's project was a structural analysis of a cantilever design. She'd built a physical model from materials she'd sourced herself, designed the testing apparatus, run the stress calculations, documented the failure points. She'd titled it, without asking Grant's opinion on the title, Where Things Break and Why That Matters. He'd read the paper she'd written to accompany it. He'd read it twice, alone in the kitchen at 11 p.m. 2 nights before the showcase, and then sat with it for a while before going to bed. She was better than he'd been at 14. This was not sentiment, it was a technical assessment from a person who had the reference points to make it. The gymnasium was full of the particular noise of parents trying to understand their children's work without appearing to not understand it, and teachers trying to give everyone equal attention, and students oscillating between pride and the practiced performance of not caring about their own pride. Grant arrived in a dark jacket that was neither the oil-stained green one from Harlow Point nor the worn one from the kitchen table, a third jacket, clean, unremarkable, purchased 18 months ago for a conference he'd attended in Seattle and worn perhaps 6 times since. Paige had seen him putting it on that morning and said, "That jacket's a little big on you," with the tone of someone noting a fact and filing it for later. "It's fine," he'd said. "It makes you look like you borrowed it. I like this jacket. You like all your jackets. That's the problem." He wore it anyway. Vanessa was there. He'd known she would be. They'd exchanged a text 2 days prior, brief and functional, coordinating arrival times, so Paige didn't have to manage the geography of separated parents in a small gymnasium. Vanessa arrived 12 minutes after Grant, in a gray coat he didn't recognize, without Conrad Sterling. He noticed the absence. He didn't remark on it. They stood on opposite sides of Paige's display, for the first 20 minutes Grant talking to Paige's science teacher, who wanted to discuss the stress calculation methodology with someone who could follow it, and Vanessa talking to another parent she apparently knew, and then the geometry of the gymnasium arranged them, inevitably, in the same 3 feet of space in front of Paige's model. "She explained the cantilever to me last week," Vanessa said. "I understood about 40% of it." "Which 40%? "The part where she said if you get the load distribution wrong, everything falls apart." "That's the important 40%, Grant said. Paige appeared from the other side of the display table, so I'm standing together, and performed a careful non-reaction that fooled neither of them. "Mr. Dietrich wants to talk to you," Paige told Grant. "He's the one by the blue display. He said he used to work in materials science. I'll find him. Mom, Mrs. Okafor was looking for you. Something about the spring fundraiser." "I'll find her too," Vanessa said. Paige looked between them with the evaluating expression of someone who has managed adult human beings for years and finds the work tedious but necessary. "You can also just talk to each other," she said. "It's fine. I'm not 12. She went back to her display. Grant and Vanessa looked at each other with the shared recognition of 2 people who have just been efficiently managed by someone considerably younger than them. "She's terrifying," Vanessa said. "She's efficient," Grant said. "Same thing." They stood together for a moment in the gymnasium noise. "Conrad isn't here," Vanessa said, not quite looking at him. "I noticed. She stopped. Started again. "Things have been complicated since the hearing. Since the withdrawal." She paused. "He hasn't been easy to be around." Grant didn't say anything. "I'm not asking for sympathy," she said, with a precision that told him she'd prepared that sentence. "I made choices. He was one of them. I'm just explaining the absence." "You don't have to explain anything to me." "I know." She finally looked at him. "I know I don't." Across the gymnasium, Paige was demonstrating the load testing function of her model to a small group that had gathered. She was explaining something with her hands, the way Grant explained things when the concept was 3-dimensional, and the group was following it, leaning in. "She's going to be an engineer," Grant said. "Or something better," Vanessa said. "Something we don't have a word for yet." He looked at her. "That's a good way to put it." She almost smiled. "I have my moments." The gymnasium moved around them, parents, students, teachers, the ambient noise of people trying to connect across the gap that separates what you do from what other people understand about what you do. Grant had spent most of his professional life inside that gap. He'd stopped finding it frustrating around year 6. You either learned to live in it, or you spent all your energy trying to close it, and the energy was better used elsewhere. "I left something valuable," Vanessa said. She said it quietly, Not dramatically the way you say something when you've been working up to it for long enough that saying it is more relief than revelation. I knew what you were when we were together. I knew what you were made of. I just decided to call it something else, something smaller. She paused. I called it contentment. I said you were too content, that you weren't building anything. You weren't wrong that I was content, Grant said. I was wrong about what it meant. She looked at him. Content, because you were doing exactly what you meant to be doing, isn't the same as not going anywhere. I didn't understand that then. Grant thought about this. He thought about the kitchen table and the scratched linoleum and the load calculations on a legal pad at 5:15 in the morning and the $400 in his savings account the day he signed the first hangar lease. He thought about what it feels like to know what you're building, even before you can see its shape, and to keep building it anyway, in the ordinary hours of ordinary days, without needing anyone to witness the accumulation. It wasn't only your misreading, he said. I wasn't good at showing you what I was doing. I thought it was obvious. It wasn't. She looked slightly surprised that he'd said it. You assumed I'd see it, she said. I assumed anyone would see it. That was arrogant, in its way. He paused. Not everything that's real is visible from the outside. She nodded slowly. The gymnasium noise continued around them. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Are we okay? She asked. For Paige. We've been okay for Paige, he said. We can be okay for all of it. She nodded again. Something releasing in her expression, not happiness exactly, not resolution, but the specific easing of a person who has been carrying something heavy for long enough that setting it down feels almost unfamiliar. I'm going to find Mrs. Okafor, she said. I'll find Mr. Dietrich. She walked one direction. He walked another. In the middle of the gymnasium, Paige was still explaining her model to anyone who would listen, her hands moving, her voice carrying, entirely in her element. The Lenora Blackwood partnership was formally signed 6 weeks later, in January, in a conference room that was nicer than the one where they'd first met, but otherwise unremarkable. Because the work that gets done in conference rooms is unremarkable, it is paperwork at the end of a long chain of decisions, and the decisions are the thing, not the signing. Grant signed his name in 4 places. Raymond signed in 2. Lenora signed in 3 and handed the pen back to Priya with the air of someone completing a task that has already been mentally filed. To a working relationship, Lenora said, which was her version of a toast. To a working relationship, Raymond said, which was his version of matching her energy. Grant said nothing, which was his version of meaning it. The investment was structured in tranches, an initial commitment, a milestone-linked second tranche tied to certification, a third tied to first commercial delivery. The total, across all 3 tranches, represented a capitalization that would take Holloway Aeronautics from its current size, lean, precise, occasionally exhausting, to something with enough runway to hire the people Grant had identified as necessary and fund the next development phase without the quarterly anxiety that had lived, quietly, in the background of every decision for 9 years. He didn't feel transformed by it. He'd expected to feel something more dramatic, and instead felt something quieter, the satisfaction of a structure that is now adequate to the weight it needs to carry, which is a different feeling from excitement, but more durable. Raymond felt enough excitement for both of them, which was appropriate. The FAA certification came through in October, which was a month later than the revised July filing had projected, because the certification process is the certification process, and it proceeds at its own pace regardless of what anyone needs from it. Grant was at Harlow Point when Raymond called with the news, standing in the hangar with Marcus going over the Vanderberg schedule, and he put the phone down and told Marcus. Marked October, he said. October, Grant confirmed. You said July. I said July was the target. You said you were confident about July. I said I was confident about the filing. The certification timeline is the FAA's. Marcus considered this with the expression he reserved for situations where Grant's precision had shaded into something that technically absolved him of a bad prediction. Fine, he said, October. Do we tell the team? Tell the team. Marcus went to tell the team. Grant stayed in the hangar for a moment. He thought about the composite layering method, the specific geometry of the thing, the way it distributed load across a surface in a pattern that was not obvious until you understood it, at which point it seemed like the only sensible solution. He thought about Derek Paulson, who had looked at that method and seen something worth selling rather than something worth building. He thought about the different ways people assess value, what's in front of them right now, versus what it becomes over time if you're patient enough to wait for it. The damages resolution with Sterling Crest-connected entities had concluded in September, a negotiated settlement that included a payment to Holloway Aeronautics, a non-disclosure clause that prevented Sterling from discussing the terms, and a comprehensive waiver of any future claims connected to the composite layering method. Diana had framed it as a favorable outcome. Grant had accepted it as what it was not vindication exactly, because the hearing that would have established the full public record had been preempted by the withdrawal, but a close of the chapter. The money was useful. The closure was more useful. Conrad Sterling was not a reduced man exactly. His name still appeared in business coverage. Sterling Crest Holdings still operated. But two of the institutional investors who had been at Harlow Point that October afternoon had quietly withdrawn from a real estate fund Sterling had been building, and Lenora Blackwood's name appeared nowhere near anything connected to him, and in the specific world of aviation investment, that mattered in ways that didn't require public announcement. Grant thought about Conrad occasionally, not with satisfaction, which felt like the wrong response to someone's professional erosion, but with a kind of sober curiosity. What makes a person decide that the fastest path to having something is to take it rather than build it? He'd never fully understood that wiring. He'd met people who had it, worked around them, sometimes been targeted by it. But the internal logic of it, the calculation that acquisition was more reliable than creation, remained genuinely opaque to him. Maybe it was what happened when you'd been winning by leverage for long enough that you forgot leverage had limits. Maybe it was what happened when your identity got too tangled up with the outcome to tolerate the uncertainty of building something that might fail. Grant had built things that failed, designs that didn't work, partnerships that dissolved, a marriage that had come apart in the ordinary painful way that marriages come apart when two people grow in different directions, and neither of them notices until the distance is too large to close comfortably. Failure was not, in his experience, fatal. It was information. You worked with it. He supposed some people didn't believe that. He supposed some people needed the outcome settled in advance, by whatever means were available, because the uncertainty of the legitimate path was more than they could hold. He felt something like pity for that, which surprised him. Pity was not the emotion he'd have predicted. Paige got into the engineering summer program at a university 3 states away. She told him on a Thursday evening, showing him the email on her phone with the studied casualness of someone who has been refreshing their inbox for 48 hours and has carefully composed their face for the moment of revelation. He read the email. He read it again. "This is the one you wanted," he said. "It's the one I applied to," she said, in a tone calibrated to suggest she had applied to many, and this was simply one of them. Paige. "It was my first choice," she admitted. He handed the phone back to her. He put his hand on the top of her head, a gesture she had been intermittently tolerant of since she was approximately 4 years old, and she let him leave it there for a moment before she ducked out from under it with the dignified discomfort of a teenager accepting affection. "You did this," he said. "I did my application. That's what I mean." She looked at him with the slightly sideways assessment she'd had since childhood, that particular angle of evaluation that had always made him feel, in the best possible way, like he was being accurately read. "You helped," she said. "I confirmed calculations you'd already run. You sat with me for 3 hours. Because it was interesting. Dad." She tucked the phone into her pocket. "Just say you're proud of me." "I'm proud of you," he said, without hesitation. "I've been proud of you since you were approximately 7 years old, and you told me the ceiling fan was inefficient. I said it was loud. You said it was making more noise than it was producing airflow, which is an efficiency argument." She considered this. "I was 7. I know. That was the impressive part." She went to her room. He stood in the kitchen for a moment, in the house with the scratched linoleum floor that he'd finally replaced 3 months ago, not because anyone pressured him to, but because one Saturday he'd had 4 unscheduled hours and a standing account at the hardware store, and he'd done it while Paige was at a friend's house, and she'd come home and looked at the floor and said, simply, "Finally," which had been in its way the correct response. He made dinner. Nothing significant pasta, a sauce he made from habit rather than recipe, the kind of meal that gets made on Thursday evenings in houses where someone ate lunch in a hangar and didn't think about dinner until it was already necessary. He made too much, as he always did, a habit from the years when Paige was younger, and he was never entirely sure how hungry she'd be. He thought about what he wanted to tell her before she left for the summer program, not a speech, because he didn't give speeches, but the particular kind of conversation that happens between parents and children when a chapter is ending and both of them know it, and neither of them wants to make too large a thing of it, because making a large thing of it would make it harder. What he wanted to tell her was something he hadn't fully articulated even to himself, which was that the world had a persistent habit of mistaking quiet for absence. That the people who didn't announce themselves, who wore old jackets and drove trucks with broken window handles and crouched beside landing gear assemblies without looking up when someone tried to dismiss them, those people were not empty spaces in the landscape. They were load-bearing. The structure held because of them, even when no one was looking at them, even when everyone was looking elsewhere. He wanted to tell her that the noise people make about their own importance is rarely proportional to the importance. That the most significant work he'd ever done had been done in ordinary hours, in cold hangars, on legal pads at 5:15 in the morning, with coffee and a pen that needed refilling. He wanted to tell her to build the thing, whatever the thing was, to build it in the time she had, with the resources available, without waiting for the moment when it would feel safe or obvious or sufficiently recognized. There was no such moment. There was only the work and the accumulation of the work in the morning. Eventually, when you looked at what had accumulated and understood that it had been enough all along. He wanted to tell her to be honest when things were wrong, not theatrical honest. That honesty about a problem, delivered without drama, was one of the more powerful things a person could do in a professional setting, because most people spent significant energy managing the appearance of having no problems, and someone who looked at the problem and named it clearly had an immediate structural advantage over everyone performing otherwise. He wanted to tell her that she would get things wrong, not as a warning, as a fact, as information, as the thing that made getting things right meaningful rather than inevitable. She would misjudge people. She would overextend in one direction and underextend in another. She would make decisions that seemed right at the time and looked different in retrospect. This was not failure. This was the texture of a life that was actually being lived rather than managed from a safe distance. He didn't say any of it at dinner. They ate pasta and talked about the summer program's housing situation and whether she should bring her own pillow and what the weather was like in that part of the country in June. He washed the dishes and she dried them, which was a reversal of their usual arrangement that had started some months ago and neither of them had commented on. After dinner, she went to her room. He sat at the kitchen table with the new floor under him clean, less warped, different under his feet in a way he was still occasionally noticing, and the legal pad he always had at the table, which had load calculations on the top page that were not urgent and could wait for morning. He thought about the first hangar. $400 in a savings account and one engineer and a lease on a space that smelled of aviation fuel and metal, and the specific optimism of a person who has decided to bet on a thing that doesn't exist yet. He thought about the 43-year-old version of himself, who had made coffee in this kitchen on a birthday and done calculations on a legal pad and driven a daughter to school in a truck with a broken window handle and had not been, at any point in that morning, aware of being anything other than what he was. There was a version of Grant Holloway's story that could be told as a triumph: the company, the partnership, the certification, the man who turned out to be worth more than the people who dismissed him had calculated. That version was not wrong, but it was also not, Grant felt, the most accurate version. The most accurate version was about something quieter, about what it means to know your own value independently of whether anyone else is confirming it, about the difference between building something to prove a point and building something because the thing needs to exist, and you're the person positioned to build it. Conrad and Sterling had tried to take the composite layering method because he'd recognized its value. What he hadn't understood, what he couldn't understand, because it was outside the range of his particular way of seeing, was that the method existed because Grant had spent a decade in rooms most people would find unglamorous, solving problems most people would never notice needed solving, without waiting for anyone to certify the process as worthwhile. The value had not been created by the recognition. The recognition had eventually caught up to the value. These were not the same thing, and confusing them was an error with significant practical consequences. Grant understood this. He had always, in some inarticulate way, understood this. It was the thing that had let him stay crouched beside a landing gear assembly while a man in a well-fitted suit told him to carry bags, without anger, without the need to explain himself, without the particular defensiveness of a person whose sense of themselves depends on external confirmation. He knew what he was building. He had always known. The not knowing had never been his problem. He flipped past the load calculations to a blank page and wrote, in his regular handwriting, that Page had once described as technically legible but deeply unconcerned about being read, the outline of a problem he'd been turning over for 3 weeks, a materials question in the next development phase, something that didn't have a clean solution yet, and would require the kind of sustained, unglamorous thinking that was, in the end, the only kind that produced anything worth having. He worked for an hour. The house was quiet around him. The kitchen floor was new under the table. The ceiling fan in Page's room turned smoothly, without complaint. Outside, the night did what nights do, held everything in the dark without judgment, letting the work and the accumulated work and the quiet life of a man who had built something real rest in the ordinary silence of an ordinary house, unremarked upon, completely sufficient, exactly enough. He worked at the kitchen table until 11, which was later than he usually worked on weekdays. But the materials problem had opened into something he hadn't anticipated, a secondary question about thermal expansion coefficients at altitude that complicated the primary calculation in a way that was genuinely interesting rather than merely difficult. There was a difference. Difficult problems made him tired. Interesting problems made him forget he was tired, which was its own kind of fuel. He closed the legal pad at 11:14. Not because he'd solved it, but because he'd found the edge of what he could usefully think about without sleep. And past that edge, the thinking became less reliable in ways that were hard to detect in the moment and obvious in retrospect. He'd learned this about himself around year 4 of the company, when he'd made an error in a stress calculation at 1 in the morning that had cost him 2 weeks of rework and a conversation with Raymond that he still thought about occasionally. Not with shame, but with the specific memory of a lesson that had been expensive enough to stay learned. He turned off the kitchen light and stood in the dark for a moment. The house settled around him, the small sounds of a structure adjusting to the temperature drop of late night. Sounds he'd learned to hear as the house doing what houses do, rather than as anything requiring attention. He checked the door, which was a habit, and then checked it again, which was also a habit and a slightly different one, the second check, not for security, but because his mind was still on the thermal expansion problem, and his body was going through the motions of a routine it knew by heart while the other. Part of him remained at the table with the legal pad. He went upstairs. Page's door was closed, the thin line of light underneath it gone, which meant she was either asleep or doing what she sometimes did, reading with her phone screen turned low enough that she thought it didn't show. He didn't knock. He stood in the hallway outside her door for a moment, in the way that parents stand outside their children's rooms without entirely knowing why, and then went to his own room. He woke at 5:15, which was not a decision. It was simply what happened. He lay still for the usual moment, the one where the mind comes back online and begins its inventory of the day, the week, the open problems. The thermal expansion question was first. Then the Vanderberg inspection, which Marcus had already handled, but which Grant wanted to review the documentation on before it was filed. Then the conversation he needed to have with Raymond about the second phase hiring plan, which had been on the schedule for 2 weeks and kept getting displaced by things that were more urgent. Then, underneath all of it, the quieter inventory. Paige leaving in June for the summer program, 5 months away. The longest she'd been away from him since she was born, which was a fact he held with the careful neutrality of a person who knows how to feel something, without letting the feeling make decisions for him. He got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with the legal pad. The thermal expansion problem looked different in the morning, the way problems often did, not easier exactly, but differently shaped. The edge he'd found at 11 p.m. was still there, but in the morning light he could see 2 steps beyond it that he hadn't been able to see the night before. He worked for 40 minutes before he heard Paige's alarm from upstairs, and another 10 before she appeared in the kitchen doorway in the specific state of dishevelment that represented her baseline on school mornings. She looked at him, at the coffee, at the legal pad. "You slept," she said. It was an assessment, not a question. "I slept. You look like you slept. That's different from usual. I usually sleep. You usually look like you've been having a conversation with something in the ceiling." She went to the cabinet for a glass. Problem you're working on. Is it the thermal one? He looked at her. How do you know about the thermal one? You said expansion coefficient in your sleep 3 nights ago. She poured water, drank it, set the glass in the sink. You really should get that checked. The sleep talking or the expansion coefficient? Both, probably. She went to make toast. They ate breakfast in the comfortable, parallel way they'd developed over years of shared mornings, each doing their own thing, occasionally intersecting, no performance of togetherness required. Paige read something on her phone. Grant worked on the legal pad. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the November morning was doing the things November mornings did in that part of the country, which was mostly be gray and cold and indifferent to anyone's schedule. I talked to Mom yesterday, Paige said, without looking up from her phone. About the program about Conrad. She set the phone down. They're not together anymore. She said it's been a few months. She didn't make a big deal of it. She just said she wanted me to know. Grant kept his eyes on the legal pad for a moment, then looked at his daughter. How do you feel about that? I don't know him that well. We met a few times. She considered, formal. Like he was always on the way somewhere more important. She picked up her toast. Mom seemed tired when she said it. Not sad exactly. More like someone who's been carrying something that turned out to be heavier than it looked. Grant nodded slowly. She also said. Paige paused in the way she paused when she was deciding how much of a thing to say. She said she made some mistakes. Not just with him. With a lot of things. She didn't say your name, but I think she meant the end of your marriage. Your mother doesn't need to be relitigated, Grant said. I'm not relitigating. I'm telling you what she said. Paige looked at him directly. She's trying. I think she's genuinely trying. I know she is. You're not going to say anything else about it. What do you want me to say? Paige thought about this. I want you to say that it's okay. That we're all going to be okay. Not in the way adults say it when they mean stop asking, but actually. Grant put down his pen. We're okay, he said. Your mother and I have been okay for a while. Not okay in the way we were when we were married, that's gone, and it should be, it ran its course, but okay in the way that matters for you. And okay for each other as people who made something together that turned out to be genuinely worth making. Paige held his gaze for a moment. That's a very careful answer. It's an honest one. I know. She picked up her phone again. That's why it's careful. He smiled at the legal pad. She didn't see it or pretended not to. Vanessa called 3 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon when Grant was at Harlow Point, going over the second phase documentation with Raymond. Stepped outside to take it, standing on the tarmac in the December cold with the field quiet around him. I wanted to call, she said. Not because anything's wrong. Just to call. Okay, he said. Paige told you about Conrad. She mentioned it. I should have told you myself. It felt I didn't know how to say it without it being complicated. It's not complicated, Grant said. You don't need to explain your life to me. I know. But I wanted you to know. She paused. I think I wanted you to know because it felt like something I needed to say to you specifically, not for information purposes. She stopped. I'm not explaining this well. You're explaining it fine. I'm trying to say that I made a decision 2 years ago that was partly about running toward something and partly about running away from something I didn't know how to value correctly. And I'm still working out what that means. For my own understanding of myself. Grant stood on the tarmac. Across the field, a small aircraft was making its approach in the gray afternoon light, descending with the specific deliberateness of a thing that knows exactly where it's going. That sounds like hard work, he said. It is, a pause. You never ran away from anything, did you? He thought about it honestly. I ran away from some things. I ran away from conversations I should have had about the marriage. I ran away into the work when the work was easier than everything else. He paused. Running looks different depending on which direction you're going. Mine happened to be toward something. That doesn't mean it wasn't also away from something. She was quiet for a moment. I never thought of it that way. Neither did I for a long time. The aircraft touched down on the far runway, clean and certain, its wheels finding the surface without drama. Grant watched it run out. Thank you, Vanessa said. For all of it. The way you handled everything this fall. The way you've always handled Paige. The way she stopped. You were always the most decent person I knew. I just didn't have the right name for it when it mattered. He didn't know what to say that wouldn't be too much or too little, so he said the true thing, which was the same thing it had always been. Take care of yourself, Vanessa. You too, she said. Happy birthday, by the way. Paige said it's this week. He'd actually forgotten. Wednesday, he said. Same as always. Same as always. She hung up. He stood on the tarmac for another minute, in the cold and the quiet, watching the aircraft that had landed taxi toward its hangar, and felt something settle in him, not resolution. Because life did not resolve in the clean way that stories sometimes suggested, but a rightness about the current arrangement of things. The distance between what had been and what was now felt appropriate. Earned, in the way that some distances are earned rather than merely traversed. He went back inside to finish the documentation with Raymond. Raymond looked at him when he came back in. Vanessa? Yes. Everything okay? Everything's fine. Raymond nodded, asked no further questions, and returned to the page he'd been reviewing. This was, Grant thought, one of the underrated qualities of a 9-year partnership, the accumulated understanding of which silences were full and which were empty, and the wisdom to treat them accordingly. They worked for another 2 hours. The documentation was thorough. The second phase was ready. Outside, the field went from gray afternoon to early dark in the way December managed, quickly and without ceremony, and the lights came on across Harlow Point one by one, steady and yellow-white, the same as they always were. Grant gathered his papers, put on his jacket, the green one, the one with oil on the sleeve that he had genuinely been meaning to replace since the previous spring and had genuinely not replaced, because it fit right and it was warm and the oil stain was on the left sleeve where it didn't bother him, and walked out to the truck. He sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. He thought about Wednesday, which was his birthday, which he would spend the same way he spent most Wednesdays, coffee at 5:15, calculation on a legal pad, page to school, meetings, the work, the accumulated ordinary hours of a life that looked, from the outside, like nothing in particular, and from the inside like exactly what he'd meant to build. He started the truck. The broken window handle on the passenger side had been replaced in October, finally, along with the navigation system update and the wiper blades. The truck was still 7 years old. It still needed the rear suspension looked at. He had a note about it somewhere on the legal pad, under the thermal expansion calculations, waiting with the patience of a problem that is real but not yet urgent. He drove home through the December dark and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table with the new floor and the legal pad and the coffee that was always slightly too strong, and worked on the problem that didn't have a clean solution yet, and felt, without needing to name it or perform it or prove it to anyone at all, completely and precisely like himself.